Welcome to Manufacturing Talks with Jim Vinoski. Industry has a million cool stories, and Jim talks to the movers and shakers who are making them happen. Let's dive in.
Hey guys, Jim Vinoski with Manufacturing Talks. All right, I'm going to be solo today and I'm going to be fairly brief. I'm going to talk about something that I've written about a few times and it still keeps bubbling up out there. So try to use this outlet to also get the message out. And that is, here's the deal. There's no ironclad rule that says as a country gets wealthy, it becomes a service economy. Okay? There is no such rule. Maybe you've heard that a million times over because it's been said for at least 3 decades, if not 4, maybe more. I don't know. I'm pretty sure I started hearing it back in the 1980s when I was coming out of college. So people have repeated it ad infinitum, and not without reason, but without looking into the details. So I'm here to give you the details. And here's the thing. You don't just declare there's this ironclad rule and, oh, look, every country I can think of has done this. So therefore you can't avoid it. And oh, by the way, therefore you can't bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States like we're talking about now. So there's a whole lot of nonsense in that whole approach. Number one, that there's this rule is just totally unsupported. Okay. People will point to, well, every country in the Western world, starting back in the 80s or 90s, manufacturing cratered. Okay, so somehow this rule is there just because this one thing happened. That is a logical fallacy. It's called the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, meaning after this, therefore because of this. And you can't say that. Just because something happens after another thing does not establish causation in any regard. And in this case, what the people are doing is saying, oh, well, this happened, therefore there's this rule, without ever looking at why did it happen? Okay, why did most of the Western countries deindustrialize to some degree starting back in the 1980s and getting worse in the late 90s, early 2000s? Well, because they all did a lot of the same stupid stuff. Number one is just piling on regulations on regulations on regulations. So making our manufacturing less competitive. I've written about this, and I'll include a link in the show description to one of those articles. I've written about it quite extensively. All of the Western countries, all of the European countries and the former British Empire and America did this and did it about the same time, starting back in the 1970s and accelerating through the end of last century and getting even crazier and crazier right up until the recent years. And so there were things that made us less competitive, and therefore we were unable to compete with burgeoning manufacturers that were establishing themselves overseas or being established by governments in some cases. Another thing is financial rules and regulations, whether it's government imposed or market imposed. We did a lot of stupid things that discourage manufacturing. Number one being this whole notion that manufacturing assets are a drag on a company, and therefore if you can get rid of them, that's a good thing. And so I also wrote about that. I'll include that link. Return on net capital is one measure. There are other abbreviations for it, but it's basically this, that having these long-term investments is bad and having these assets on your books is bad. And so getting rid of those things is good. And therefore, we're going to sell off all our manufacturing or send it overseas, and then we're a stronger corporation. Well, that's kind of nonsense because now you don't have the productive assets, and you see that happen again and again. Clayton Christensen wrote about it in his book, What Will You Do With Your Life? I think it was. I'll include the title in the description. But he wrote about how Dell kind of gave away different parts of their production to what eventually became ASUS, one of their main competitors, and they lost that ability to manufacture. We're seeing it today in the bicycle industry, where all our domestic bicycle makers have stopped making bicycles, and now they're kind of behind the eight ball because of tariffs, because of other things. And we could see a bunch of them going under because they followed this addled financial advice to their detriment. Another one, unions. Sam Gregg, who was on this show quite a while ago, made this point in one of his articles I read a while back. And it came out of a study that showed that these very, how to put it, it's not worker centric, it's really union centric unions. These unions that demanded more and more and more back in the 70s and 80s and 90s just also helped make us uncompetitive. And don't get me wrong, unions, I think, in some regard, are required. I've seen personally some of the unethical, abusive behavior by companies, by corporations. And to think that you're going to go up against a company's bank of lawyers and win is, as an individual, is nonsense. And so I get why people will band together and go for collective representation. Trouble is, then you get a lot of other things happening with unions where they become just this self kind of regenerating grievance machine. And so rather than having unions and companies working to actually make profits, you have unions just seeing what they can bleed out of a company until it does away with those union workers by sending that work overseas. Kind of a dumb move, but that's what happened. And then most recently, and I've talked and written about this till I'm blue in the face, is what we've done with our electricity generation. And so, unfortunately, all of the Western world was on a path to basically complete deindustrialization. You see it continuing in places like the UK and Germany to this day. Fortunately, with the last election, the US stepped back a little bit from that precipice, not entirely, because there are still half the states that are on this green energy mandate that is making energy prices skyrocket, and that hits manufacturers especially hard. And they then decide, hey, we can go elsewhere and make things cheaper and be more competitive. That's why we have German companies now coming over to the US. Hopefully we can continue to turn the tide and get states like mine here in Michigan, where we have absolute insanity from our governor and our Democratic legislature that mandated this green energy last year, get that turned over and get back to making affordable and reliable energy, whatever that takes. And so you have all these people saying, okay, there's this rule, right? I just told you why the rule isn't really a rule, and those root causes that are really what happened to drive our manufacturing overseas. Another piece of it, though, is it's looking at this, 40 years as though that's the broad swath of history. Well, countries were getting rich long before that time frame. So I look at Great Britain during the 19th and early 20th century. I mean, you're talking about the place where the Industrial Revolution began and became a very rich country. I mean, at the turn of the 19th to 20th century, their empire, they were an extraordinarily rich country. And despite that, their manufacturing output continued to skyrocket right up until when? World War I. So what did it take to crater Great Britain's industrial output? It was 2 world wars and then all the nonsense that came in the late 20th century. So yeah, lots of causes for deindustrialization, not some ironclad rule of economics. People, and one guy who was in this big, long battle on LinkedIn with one of my contacts about all this, saying, well, if it's not a rule, then give us a counterexample. What country has turned it around? Well, I'm going to throw out a couple. One is Ireland. Ireland is actually fast, once again, increasing their manufacturing output, even though they remain in the rich country club, if you will. Yeah, they're a small country, so I'm sure that's what people will say as well. Yeah, they don't really count. Ireland's what, 5 million people, I think it is, on the whole island, even though it's two different parts of Ireland. Okay, so we'll discount Ireland. How about the United States? Our manufacturing output was growing smartly starting from about 2010 right up until COVID. So, again, you get this thing that the people talking about the ironclad rule don't include in their notions of causes is this incredibly moronic own goal that almost the whole world did around COVID, shutting down, thinking you can close an economy and then smartly restart it at your leisure. That doesn't really work that way. And we proved it. And I always say if there was ever an honest accounting of what happened during COVID, it would be seen as the worst economic own goal in the history of the world. And that's why there's never going to be a true accounting. A lot of people talking about it, a lot of people pointing out what went on. I'll include a link to another article where I have the graph of our manufacturing output and our manufacturing hiring going up to that point and then kind of tapering off or cratering. But reshoring's happening in the US today. Again, we've got German companies coming over here, companies from the UK coming over here because they can't get reliable and affordable energy and they can't compete. Hopefully they're coming here for the long haul, again, that we make those changes that we need to make and get ourselves back to being the powerhouse. I mean, we are still a powerful manufacturing nation, number 2, unfortunately, behind China. We built China, basically. We allowed them to cheat on trade agreements. We allowed them to steal intellectual property. We've treated their repeated violations of crazy subsidies and company support and dumping and all of that as though that's free trade. Well, that's not free trade. That's unfair trade. And we should be doing something about it. This administration finally is doing something about it, and we'll see how that holds. But if we can stop doing dumb things, I, for one, say the United States can once again be the number 1 manufacturing country in the world. So that's my take on things. Now you know. I've got links to the articles that go into even more details about this in the show description. Read those at your leisure, and please put your comments, your questions down in the comments section. If you think I'm loopy, if you think you've got proof that, yes, there is this ironclad rule of economics that rich countries always become service economies, go ahead and put it in there. We'll have a smart debate. I promise to be respectful. I don't promise to make it easy for you. Okay? Hey, Jim Vinoski from Manufacturing Talks signing off. Tune in next Tuesday. We'll have another show for you. Thanks. So long.
Thanks for tuning in to Manufacturing Talks with Jim Vinoski. Watch for new episodes dropping every Tuesday. And don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe.